Good evening, everyone. I am so glad that you can join us tonight. This time, we're going to be talking about the words that activists have been using to describe their ideas in the environment of the classrooms where our kids are in school. Their jargon sounds with really nice words, things like anti-racism, social emotional learning, and gender affirming care. But when you start to dig a little bit in what it actually means, and you as a parent try to understand what are actually the kids learning about these words in the schools, it makes you go like, and think twice about what exactly are being told in the classroom, our kids, in these topics. Here to discuss this topic with me tonight, we have Libby Emmons. She is the editor-in-chief for the Millennial. We have Wilfred Reilly, author and assistant professor of political science at Kentucky State University, and Jason Littlefield. He is the executive director of Empower Pathways and co-founder and co-editor of The Free Black Thought. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us tonight for this conversation. I think it's going to be really enlightening and empowered for our parents and our audience in general to hear about these woke words and what these terms actually mean. So let's just go ahead and get started. I'm going to fire up to you, Libby, and tell us a little bit in your environment and in your experience. You realize that we use words all the time, thousands of them every day. Your publication, puts out countless of those in the forms of articles and whatnot, both printed and online. In our case, when we look at someone like it's in your field or your environment, how do parents know what to look for when they are reading printed material, online material that has to do with this topic? What should they be looking for when they are trying to review things like curriculums in the classroom, books, teaching materials, what the school districts are putting in the form of policies and guidelines? What would be your huge red flags for you to recommend parents to be watching for?
So the first thing that parents need to understand is any materials that they are reading from schools, whether it's about curriculum or whether it's about policies, or any materials they are reading or getting from government or from the district or from media outlets. The people who are writing these materials have a specific viewpoint, and you can sort of tell what that viewpoint is based on the words that they use. And you can have a sense of just what they are advocating for by the words that are used. So if you are reading about policies as regards gender at school, if you are reading something that says that the school is a gender affirming environment, or that they will help with social transition or any of these type of things, what you are reading is material from the perspective that boys and girls can change their biological sex simply by saying so, and with the help of drugs and surgeries. When somebody tells you that they are gender affirming or that they are in favor of gender affirming policies, what they are telling you is that they do not believe that biological sex is real, and that they believe that boys and girls can change their biological sex fully. So that is something to distinctly watch out for. Anytime you see terms as regards gender transition, such as preferred pronouns or gender neutral bathrooms, gender neutral sports teams, anything like this, you are hearing from someone who very distinctly does not think that boys and girls need to grow up into adult men and women, but can swap out their sex characteristics for the opposite sex characteristics with drugs and surgeries and language and social presentation.
Interesting. Libby, you mentioned a lot the word affirmation. And this is one that, if it's one of those terms that for your average mom and dad, it might sound nice because, it implies that is something that is like a positive encouragement. However, in this context of what is happening in the classrooms in our schools nowadays, it might not necessarily mean that we're thinking, as parents. Can you please elaborate a little bit more on that one?
Sure. So affirmation sounds like a great word. It sounds supportive and kind. It sounds like it's full of compassion, and that it's designed to help kids and do right by kids and parents. But that's not actually how the term has evolved. That's not what it's intended to discuss. When you hear the term affirmation, specifically gender affirmation, what you are hearing about are gender policies that will tell boys and girls that they can be the opposite sex. That's what it means. So it means that if a child comes to the school and says, a girl child comes to the school and says, really, maybe I'm a boy, then the teachers will immediately say, if they are practicing affirmation, the teachers will say, oh, you are really a boy. What is your new name? What would you like us to call you? Do you want to use the boys' bathroom? Let's get you hooked up with a guidance counselor to start discussing what else should happen now that you are really, really and truly a boy. They don't take into consideration that this could be a feeling, that this could be a phase, that this could just be something they've heard somewhere else. They actually grab onto it and say, okay, you are really a boy now. Let's run with that. And there is guidance across the US in lots and lots of school districts in places you wouldn't expect, in Wisconsin, in Oklahoma, in all of these places that you imagine are red states that don't have this sort of thing. There are policies where teachers and school districts will do this at school for kids. Will change your child's name if your child requests it. Will change your child's pronouns if they request it. Will allow them to use the boys' bathroom if they are a girl, if the child requests it. They will go along with these changes and not feel responsible to tell the parents about these changes. And this has happened in Florida and in New York and in California. This happens all over the country. And their justification is that in case parents are abusive or in case parents will be not accepting, they don't want to expose the child to these horrible parents who just want their kids to grow up healthy. And we've even seen cases in Florida where a father had to sue eventually because he was only made aware of the fact that his daughter was identifying as a boy at school, using a boy's name, using boys' pronouns and all like this. He was only aware of that after his daughter had tried to hang herself in a school bathroom. And then he became aware of it. And when he said to the school, why didn't you tell me about this? Why didn't you give me information as to what was going on with my child at school? They said, we were worried that you would not be accepting because you are Catholic. So they used the religion of the family to drive a wedge between parents and child. And they used this religion against him. And what he said back to the school was, you absolutely have no understanding of my religion, which instructs me and tells me to love my child no matter what. So it can be really very destructive, and it's been destructive in many families.
It is unbelievable. It's actually tragic in some of those cases. I was very aware of that case in Florida too, and it was unbelievable. Wilfred and Jason, I don't know if there is anything else that you guys would like to add in this topic. I can tell you for sure that there are two things that we're listening and hearing from parents a lot in this topic of the terminology, especially with the preferred pronouns and all that. Number one is that I find that it's like a huge irony that we're talking about minors that requires mom and dad to sign a consent for the school nurse to give them a Tylenol if they have a headache. And then on the other side, all these systems and all these policies in place that are being managed by adults in the school districts then are giving minors the power to make this type of like really, really, deep, important, life altering decisions when they are not legally, mature enough to consent into something like that. I find that extremely absurd. And in the same line, with the excuse of the abuse, I mean, everybody that works on education knows there are mandatory reporters. All states in the United States already have laws and procedures in place to protect minors that are suspected to be in situations that are related to abuse and neglect. If that is the real concern that we have with the students and teenagers in situations like this, why aren't they using the procedures, the legislation, and the processes that are already in place to protect minors from this type of safety concerns and abuses? Jason, what do you think about this entire idea of the affirmation and some of the examples that Libby was mentioning too?
Well, obviously, it's all awful and horrible. One thing that parents can do is affirm your child for their whole self and remind them that they are to be celebrated for who they are as a whole entire person, and they are not to be nitpicked and celebrated for pieces of and aspects of themselves, and to ask their children, what is going on in school? Are these gender affirming things, are you hearing about them? Because as Libby mentioned, there is this barrier kind of to keep parents out, like parents are somewhat perceived as the bad guys. So I think it's important for parent and children to be engaged in conversation about what is really happening. Is our schools doing things when parents aren't knowing? And then parents can talk to each other as
Yeah,
well. And then one,
definitely communication it's a huge part of this, especially when we're talking about middle schools and high school kids. Keeping like the lines of communications open with them, I think, is crucial for us as parents to tackle these type of situations too. Will, do you have any specific thoughts about these, words of affirmations and all these examples that Libby was mentioning before?
Sure. Well, I think this kind of ties into what is going to be most of my topic. But yeah, if you're debating an intelligent leftist, the words almost never mean what a smart, normal person or even the dictionary would think that they do. So, I mean, when you talk about this, yeah, like Libby did a great job breaking this down, but gender affirmation doesn't mean that you're being affirmed in terms of the sex that you actually are. It means that you're going to be in some way transitioned to resemble a member of the other sex. Gender itself has been totally kind of divorced from sex. Gender theory is one of the most insane of these modern critical theories, without any hostility toward people that are actually dealing with gender dysphoria, which is still a part of this. But the basic idea of modern gender theory, when people say something like you don't have to be sick to be trans, what they're saying is that how masculine or feminine you feel. I think that's basically the summation of it on something like the old Butler scale, or I think it's the CGI, the gender matrix, one of these, determines in practice what your sex is. So if you're a gender nonconforming tomboy girl, I think some of our mutual friend Gabs Clark actually has a brand called Protect the Tomboy. But if you are in that situation and you take a survey that says things like, I sometimes feel uncomfortable with how my body looks or feels, and you score above point X, the piece of advice from the majority of young children's therapists today would be to treat yourself as a member of the opposite sex. I don't think that's an exaggeration. So the whole idea of gender essentially is just taking this idea of how masculine or feminine or normal you feel. A lot of autistic girls are getting dragged into this, and then saying that's in practice your sex. So if I, as a 200-pound, fat, muscular man that used to play some ball, felt feminine, and I do love to cook and garden, I've taken some of these scales and they're very manipulative. It would be possible for me to say in most circumstances, well, I am a girl, I am a woman, treat me in this fashion. And that's how you get into these crazy things like the Canadian shop teacher. No one's arguing these people are females.
Yeah.
Yeah. No one's
The other
arguing
thing
it's traditional
too,
TV. It's just
It's crazy. But now, since you mentioned it, Will, all this with the, with these critical theories, many parents already know about critical race theory. It has been like a hot topic for a couple of years now, with especially when it comes to K-12 education. A lot of activist organizations and these activist teachers are saying things like, you need to raise your child to be anti-racist. You need to teach students to be culturally responsive. You need to have schools being built around equity, and all these things, again, like we were mentioning with Libby before, they sound nice. They sound like the type of kindness that we want our child to embrace. But the more we dig into it, the more we realize that is not exactly what our kids are being told in school, and most of the time we, the parents, are being kept in the dark. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and what kind of like key words or red flags as well should we as parents be looking for?
No, that's a great question. I mean, as the fallen online hero and friend of several of us, James Lindsay, once said, you get into a lot of Mott and Bailey debating tactics with this kind of thing. So the Mott, if I have the parts of a fort in correct order, but the Mott, if you're talking about critical race theory, would be something like, don't you want your children to understand the honest history of slavery, the honest history of the USA? You're not a racist, are you? And so you're absolutely right. The framework for all of this generally sounds normal. People are not saying they're going to pursue reverse racism, of course. I mean, we've all been in the business world. They're saying they're going to pursue extreme diversity, equity, and inclusion. So yeah, let's unpack some of these terms. And I guess a starting point here is that, to me at least, as a pretty solid academic, all of the critical theories are just lower IQ ripoffs of Marxism. So the core idea of the Marxist or the communist is that all of society is set up to oppress, in essence, poor people. And we don't need to go into the whole philosophy. There's a division between the bourgeoisie, the people that own the means of production, such as factories, and literally everyone else. 90% of the people are oppressed, and every structure of society, property law, marriage contracts, so on, is set up to keep poor people down, keep them in the mill. Critical race theory is literally just that model, but with the white man replacing the rich man. Fourth wave feminism is literally just that model, but with the man replacing the rich man. So feminist writers in the later waves will say things like marriage was an institution created for men to get unlimited amounts of sex. It's easy to make a couple of tacky jokes about that line, but it's a core argument of this philosophy. Queer theory, again, an awkward name, but the idea is that the straight man is replacing the rich man, and so on through all of this fat studies and peace studies and so on. So the model in every case, I think, comes down to 3 points that Chris Rufo and I once outlined for City Journal. But one, all of society is set up to oppress, to hold down precious group X. 2, the evidence of oppression is just that there are performance gaps between groups. And we'll get into that again when, I and the panel define, racism in the woke sense. But Ibram Kendi, for example, would argue that any gap in performance between large groups has to be due to bigotry, unless we're arguing for genetic inferiority, which is nonsensical, but nonetheless, that's point 2. The gaps themselves show prejudice, show bias. And point 3, the solution to this is equity, which really means proportional representation, no matter how people perform. So if you're looking at a prep school, Stuyvesant has dealt with some things like this, Bronx Science, TJ, Thomas Jefferson, the country's top ranked school, actually over there in Virginia. The argument is that if your school is not 60% whites, 8% Asians, 12% blacks, so on down the line, you're doing something wrong. These ideas are all wrong, essentially. I mean, there are major differences in study time and age and region and interest across groups. I mean, no one argues that it's an example of racism, that the National Basketball Association is 75% black and 15% Eastern European. But nonetheless, this is the argument, and it's worth unpacking some of the terminology. One of the most obvious examples of a word that sounds good but doesn't mean what you think it does is, in fact, equity. This is often intentionally confused with equality. What equity means, we just saw our only vice president, Kamala Harris, actually say this unusually bluntly, I think yesterday, but equity means everyone finishing in the same place, at least at the group level. All the men, all the women, you need the same percentage of people. This is literally the philosophy behind Title IX and many of the other educational titles, you need the same number of women, men, blacks, whites, etc., interested in every activity, or you're a bigot. So that's equity, exact proportional representation. And
which is kind of like insane, because when you look at it from the point of view of a woman, of a minority, of a disabled person, it's just a plain insult, because it is completely erasing personal merit and is by default ingraining in the mind of this person, in this case our children, that that there is something wrong with them just because of the color of their skin, or just because the way that they're built, or just because they're coming from. Therefore, in their mind, setting them like, you are inferior, you're by default, you are destined to your destiny is to fail, you're not going to be able to do it because you're the victim of somebody else that is oppressing you. And let's not even talk about when we have mixed race families, or families that children come from different cultural or race background. It's like it's insane, it's absurd. Actually, it's the word that always comes to my mind first, because what am I supposed to tell my daughter, that half of her body is a racist oppressor, and the other half is a victim that doesn't have any chance in life? That doesn't make any sense. Jason, in your experience, which are some of these kind of like concerning keywords, terms, or ideas related to CRT and this type of like, ingraining this mentality of victim against oppressor that parents should be paying attention to when it comes to what the kids are learning in the school?
I want to reinforce Will's mention of equity, and also because it also refers to equal life outcomes. Is the goal. And that's what Vice President Harris said. She said that we all end up at the same place. And so really look at your policies to see if equity. I know Austin Independent School District, where I was for 7 years, they actually have on policy equal outcome, highly equal outcomes for all students on record. And I specifically asked, what does that mean? What does that mean, and what does that look like? And I got a lot of pushback, pushed out, as a matter of fact. But if you see equal outcomes on your policy, that needs to be something that is challenged and questioned and organized around, and not an idea that we kick down the road, because those equal life outcomes are not something that a free and liberal society is about.
Libby, any thoughts from your point of view regarding this topic, and kind of like keywords or ideas, or these kind of like canned sentences or phrases that parents should be looking at when we're in the topic of, teaching critical race theory being taught to the kids in the schools and that kind of environment?
Yeah, there's a lot of these words, and these words, I think it's important for parents to realize something that's hugely important, which is, as regards gender theory, as regards critical race theory, as regards all of these concepts of, like Will was talking about power, about oppression, about all of this stuff in our schools across the United States, it's not open for conversation. It's all been decided. It's been decided before your kids got to school. It's been decided for a decade that this is how it's going to go down. It's in the literature that educators studied in their graduate programs, and educators across the country are required to have degrees in education. They're required to have master's degrees. All of the graduate teaching programs have already indoctrinated these teachers with these ideas fully and completely. So by the time your kid gets to school, these teachers, the school districts, the administrators, the literature that they're reading, the entire curriculum is set up against parents who want their kids to actually be anti-racist, which doesn't mean what you think it means, who actually want their kids to grow up healthy and as they truly are and according to who they truly are, which when educators tell you that, they're not meaning what you think it means. So it's important for parents to realize that as soon as they step through the door, as soon as they start questioning these things, the entire educational infrastructure is going to be geared up to tell you that you're wrong, geared up to tell you that you're treating your kid incorrectly. I encountered this myself. It was when my son was fourth grade, remote schooling. We had the pandemic, all the kids went home, and we were sitting here at my dining room table. My son was doing the remote learning. I kept an eye on it because he's a little boy. He's not great at sitting still. It's key to keep him on track. So the next thing we know, George Floyd was killed, which was a huge thing that happened, obviously, and it was a big deal in the educational system. We're in Brooklyn, New York. Shortly thereafter, I hear on the remote learning call that there's going to be 2 days of special learning on white privilege and systemic racism, that this is what's going to be taught in the school on remote learning. So I listened in, and I was very disturbed at what I heard. I was raised in a colorblind way, which used to be what we called anti-racist, looking at everybody based on the content of their character and not the color of their skin, not making judgments about people based on, things you might hear about a group at large, stereotypes, all of this, looking at every person as an individual who stands on their own 2 feet, having respect, dignity for all people. This is how I grew up. I imagine it's how a lot of us grew up. It's not how things are taught anymore. So yeah, keep an eye on all of that. When people say anti-racist, what they're saying is look at the color of a person's skin and make a judgment about them based on that. That's what they mean by anti-racism. I had an experience a few years ago. I was talking to an old friend. We'd gone to college together. We grew up very similarly, prep schools, relatively affluent. She's Black, I'm not. And we were chatting about, different experiences or whatever, just having a couple of drinks. And she said something to me that was shockingly different from what she had said when we were in college. What she said was that when people look at her, she wants them to see her skin color first. She wants them to identify her as Black first. And I thought, and I said, really? This is totally different than everything that we were raised with. This is different than what we studied in college. It's totally different. And she said, well, that's what I want. I don't want someone to overlook my skin color or my race. So the idea now is that by looking at everyone as though they are equal, you are overlooking these innate characteristics. So I think it's important for parents to be fully aware that the language that is being used to give you information already has bias baked in, very intentionally. It's designed to confuse you, and it's designed to tell you, it's designed to make you think the opposite of what it's actually doing. And that's true in both of these critical disciplines. Fully.
Yeah, it is unbelievable, because when you look at it, and you look at the way it's playing out in real life, it's literally like going back and implementing reverse discrimination, where we are not looking at people, by the content of their character anymore, where everything else is defined by color, by race, by whatever cultural or language background you have. Again, erasing completely the concept of personal merit, the basic concept of just being a good human being, which is really appalling. Moving into a next topic, Jason, I would like you to talk a little bit about, with your organization, Empower Pathways, you guys bring a lot of common sense approach and information to all these social emotional learning jargon and lessons embedded in curriculum, in classes, the term, everything that has to do with this educational framework, not the receiving end only that our kids get in the classroom, but also the part that has to do to how the teachers are being trained to do this, like Libby was mentioning before. So you guys have been putting all this under a really, really good microscope lately. In this specific area, what would be your advice for parents that have concerns regarding all these, SEL programs that are being sold to them, in the school districts? Like, this is really important, to raise and educate your child as a whole. However, the more they start digging into it, the more they are seeing things that is not exactly what they were told at first. What would be your advice for them?
My advice to them would be to look at anything that says social and emotional learning or SEL that has that flag and label to it, and see if it is from CASEL, if it's recognized, which is the Collaborative for Academic and Social and Emotional Learning, and to see if it tends to value and recognize the whole child, the whole person, or if it specifies looking at race and looking at gender, which most likely SEL is doing that now. I know in December of 2020 was when it shifted from a framework that did value and uplift and promote the individual to now it shifted to one that is pushing the collectivist political ideology. In fact, so much so, I don't even consider what I do to be SEL anymore, because SEL has taken such a negative label because of what it's become. But one of the fact remains is that human beings are social emotional creatures. So it makes sense to cultivate those positive traits within us and mitigate those barbaric traits. And one of those is prejudice. And one of the things that I noticed with the way that modern day anti-racism and equity and culturally responsive and all of the things that you mentioned, what that is doing by putting the emphasis on othering people, it is strengthening the social and emotional capacity for prejudice, which also strengthens the capacity for aggression and cruelty. So where the modern day SEL lessons and framework and ways that educators have been trained are getting us to look at the world and look at each other in the most awful ways for this political cause to erode our own sovereignty. So I would suggest completely pulling back from what SEL has become and challenge the school locally. See if you can sit down with the leadership and examine the curriculum and see what is the idea that it's pushing. Is it constantly talking about a problem or an issue while only kind of envisioning this utopia and putting the emphasis on the group? Or is your school still using something that is strengthening your child's character?
That's very good. And I have a follow-up question for you, Jason. Let's say that we're talking with your average mom and dad that is just barely now starting to get involved with what's happening in the schools, wants to learn more about curriculum. How do we explain, would you explain to a parent using one specific topic, what would be the difference between a lesson that is based in this traditional classical concept of social emotional learning that we know we as humans need when we are in these elementary school ages, as opposed to this new concept of the transformative SEL that has become an absolute tool of politically charged agendas and ideologies that are being rammed down the schools? How can you explain a contrasting example to a parent that is barely starting to read and listen stories about this?
I would say look at whatever the specific lesson, or if you could look at something and see where the emphasis is the emphasis on the child's group label, or is there an emphasis on the whole person? And looking at those lessons and reading through that, you can pick up on those themes very, very easily.
In your case, Will, how would you see this whole idea of the critical gender theories, the critical race theories, being actually taught in the classroom using these social emotional learning transformative frameworks now? Any thoughts or tips that you have for parents in this regard?
Well, sure. I think that there, for a while, there was this entire debate about whether CRT was being taught in the classroom. And this, again, is something that you often see when you're kind of debating the other side of this, like an endless focus on semantics and technicalities. Like, what do you mean by critical? What do you mean by CRT? Are you referring to what's taught in law school classes and so on? I think the reality is that critical theory is really, really prevalent in the classroom. This is something I talk about in my next book, actually. But I mean, like one of the most popular curricula for middle school and high school students right now comes from the 1619 Project from the New York Times. I mean, another one comes from the Zinn Education Project, which is Howard Zinn, which is pretty traditionally Marxist, as I understand. I mean, that's the People's History of America, lies your teacher told you sort of stuff. So all of that, I think all of what I think of as the alphabet soup here ties together in practice, where you have ESG. I noticed that's more a business world thing we haven't talked about yet, but CRT and new HR and SEL and all of that is generally going to be part of one package. I'm not as much of an expert as Jason in this area, but what I normally see when I supervise in college or high school classrooms is that the way this gets into SEL is that with social emotional learning, you're taught to try to understand people. And obviously, Jason might correct some of this, but in a more kindly, compassionate, individually focused way. A lot of SEL is actually pretty interesting. But when you get critical SEL or transformative SEL, you basically just backdoor a couple of traits in there. So the pitch would be something like, and when you understand someone, remember that a big part of what you're understanding is that they are oppressed. So you can do this with race, you can do this with sex, sexual orientation, which is something that educators don't really need to know about, fifth grade students, but that's increasingly coming out in these lessons. So the idea would be that you're not understanding someone as an individual in order to be able to increase your level of compassion to them or improve your leadership of them. You're understanding someone as the most important things about them, which would be, for most of these people, race, sexual orientation, maybe social class, although that's really fallen out of fashion because there are a lot of poor whites.
Well, and gender and whatever their chosen gender is.
Yeah.
The whole gender spectrum then. So like
All
sex
and
gender and
It is definitely something to keep an eye on. And then, Libby, final thoughts from your world of words and terminology and new fancy words that maybe do not mean what parents think they mean. What's your thought about all this whole idea of phasing out social emotional learning that, like Jason said, had a valid place in our children's education and using this transformative one that now we know that it's just being used as a vehicle to push all these other ideologies and agendas behind it. In your world of words, what would be your advice for us as parents in this regard?
So I think that the most important thing that parents can do is to communicate with their children, to be aware of what their children are learning, to look at what comes home, and to also instruct at home and to teach at home from a place of values, not from political perspective, not from, what the trendy ideas are, but from a place of really thought out and determined values. We're Catholic at my house, and we teach from a perspective of, equality, kindness. We speak of the Beatitudes from the Gospels, and we teach from a place of values. So when my son comes home and he tells me, this kid said this, or this other kid, or my teacher, or whatever, I, treat everyone with respect. This is what we believe, and this is why. And I'm very clear about that. So when he comes home with something crazy, he knows it's crazy already because he has a strong basis in values and in morality, and he can make judgments and make decisions by bouncing any of the options off of that standard of values and those standards of morality. So I think that that's very important. Don't be afraid to tell your child that their teacher is full of crap if you think that they are. That's not a big deal. I don't know about you guys, but I thought that about most of my teachers growing up, that they were full of it, except for a couple really good English teachers. Everyone else I thought was ridiculous. But I tell my son when he comes home, don't pay any attention to that. Anything you learn in career counseling, ignore that. You don't need it. Don't look at your phone. Be respectful. Take notes. Pass the test, but you don't need any of that. And I'm very clear about that. When he comes home with different, they were studying Langston Hughes, read the poem. Brilliant poem. You don't need all this oppression garbage, though. Just look at the work. Read the work, understand the man's life. That's the important part. When they came and they told me, we're doing catch up. This was after the schools were closed for a million years. We're doing catch up. Your son can come in the morning. Sorry, that was him calling me. I think he's off school anyway. But when they tell me, we could do this catch up after the pandemic, and I say, oh, great, because, we could use this and that in math, and I'm interested in this in science. And they say, no, it's social emotional learning catch up. And I said to his teachers, we don't need that. I'm not coming in early for that. If my son needs more confidence, if he needs all of this stuff, he's going to get that by doing better in school, by understanding concepts better, by doing better at his tests or whatever it is, by getting better at music and art. These are the things that are going to give your kids confidence, not a whole bunch of random garbage that is getting spit out by a bunch of people who just finished graduate school and they think they're actually trying to save the world by indoctrinating your kid. That's not going to help anybody. It's not going to help your kid. You know your kid. You know what's important. You know the truth. Teach it to them. And don't be afraid to contradict the teachers when they say a bunch of nonsense.
That's good.
And tell your kids, tell your kids, that's nonsense.
All great examples. And I think it goes back to what we all have been looping around. It has to do with communication, and always communicate and teach our kids at home, like you were saying, from a place of value and principle, instead of from a place of ideology or political agendas. As we get ready to kind of like wrap up this conversation, I have like a quick list of terms that I want to shoot out at you directly, and give me like a quick thought. One or two sentences that you might have about it. In this part, it's just some of these popular terms that activist teachers use a lot, that parents, again, are just starting to hear and discover now. And I would like for you all to, again, give like a brief explanation of it, so our audience can have like a recap and park it in the back of their filing cabinet in their heads to keep an eye open for them in the future. The first one is for you, Will. Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter is a political slogan. Again, that's a classic Mott and Bailey, because the idea, if you disagree with it at all, is don't you think Black Lives Matter? You racist and so on. The reality is that everyone thinks essentially the response slogan, all lives matter, is a bit more correct. But Black Lives Matter is taking something that no one could inherently disagree with, making it political. What that means is defund police, so on down the line in practice.
Good. The next one for you, Libby, misgendering.
Misgendering is a totally made up concept that is designed to insult anybody and make you believe that lies are true. Lies are not true. Misgendering is what is meant when you refer to a man who believes he is a woman as a man. They will say that this is misgendering. If you refer to, for example, Biden's Assistant Health and Human Services Secretary as he, that is misgendering. Dr. Rachel Levine is transgender. So you're supposed to lie to yourself and to that person and to everybody else by referring to them by the made up pronouns that they have come up with. Don't give into it.
Your turn, Jason. Your quick fire up answer for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Those are the value replacements for individualism, meritocracy, and believing that we're all created equal. Diversity is different skin colors, different genders, but we all have to believe the same thing. Equity, equal outcomes, And inclusion is the inclusion of all of the oppressed groups against the oppressor group.
Next one back at you, Will. Racial affinity group.
The one sentence answer is segregation. I mean, a racial affinity group is, and I've encountered these as an executive several times. You literally divide up the pool. In my experience, it's usually been of men. I'm sure it's often quite diverse, but by race. So you'd have all of the black guys in one corner of the room and the white guys at the back table, Hispanic men in a side room, Asian somewhere else. And the idea is that this will somehow make different groups work together better because everyone will first be more in tune with their own group. It seems to me to be one of the least likely to work ideas I've ever encountered.
I can imagine. Back at you, Libby. Non-binary.
Non-binary is a term used by people who really want to be trendy and trans, but it turns out they're not. So what this means is that you are claiming that you identify as neither male nor female. But what it really does is it reinforces the idea that you have to identify according to a certain gender and a certain set of gender stereotypes. You do not. There is no one right way to be a woman. There is no one right way to be a man. If you are male, you are a man. If you are an adult, if you are a male and you are a child, you are a boy. It doesn't matter if you are wearing dresses or fingernail polish or baseball caps or playing with trucks or taking ballet lessons. None of that matters. None of that has an impact on your actual biology, which there is no way to change. So non-binary really is just like it's just like a gateway to trans, and it's totally meaningless. It's what we used to call just being yourself without concern for gender stereotypes.
That's great. And the final one back at you, Jason. Tell us about global citizen.
This is to begin to shift thinking away from being a sovereign citizen of a sovereign nation when we think of ourselves as part of this global society with equal outcomes. And as somebody that has lived in the third world and walked in the third world, and thinking about equal outcomes for all global citizens, we will all own nothing and be happy and eat bugs, I guess.
Oh boy. Well, it's time to wrap up our final thoughts. I am so glad that we were able to get together and have this conversation. But before we go, we would like to wrap up finals ideas on, again, these red flags regarding terminology that parents need to be aware of, and also action items or a specific, actions that you would recommend parents take when dealing with this type of, jargon and terminology and things being put in the curriculums in the classrooms where their kids are learning. Libby, I'll let you go first, really quick. Final thoughts about woke jargon and made up words.
Teach your kids the truth. Just teach them the truth. Reality exists. Truth exists. Teach it to them and know everything that they're studying. And if you don't, like, at my son's school, suddenly there's no textbooks anymore. Suddenly we don't get worksheets. Everything's in a Google Classroom. It's very difficult to figure out what they are learning and what they are being taught. And if you can't figure it out, ask the teachers, demand the curriculum, see the syllabus, just look at it. When your kid comes home with a book that they're supposed to read for school, read it, follow along, see what they're doing in math, make sure that they're actually doing arithmetic instead of talking about their feelings about triangles. Take a look at it. What is the science that they are being taught? And this goes across the board. Are they being taught that it's a climate apocalypse and they should be terrified every minute of their lives? Figure it out. Take a look. Do some reading. Share with your kids your research. Look into it.
Great. Thank you.
Open those lines of communication if they're not. Your kid is a human being, and it's up to you to make sure that they grow up into an adult who knows the truth, knows what's up, can take care of themselves and the people they love.
Yeah, it is like it's never enough important to reiterate and talk about opening communications line and talking with them, like you were saying before, from a place of value and principle. Thank you so much, Libby. Will, last thoughts about this, jargon and made up words that we're trying to warn parents about.
Yeah, I think Libby summed a lot of this up quite well, actually. One advantage that kind of that mainstream sort of center right, the normal world that most of these parents fall into has in this is that what our opponents are saying is not actually brilliant or unique or based on kind of new hard knowledge. A lot of it's just kind of dumb. I mean, the idea that all gaps between groups, that's the one I focus on in my professional writing, are due to racism is just insane. I mean, Asian kids study twice as much as either white or black kids. I mean, the most common age for a black man's 27. For a white guy, it's 58. So, I mean, if you adjust for any of this stuff, most of the gaps vanish. And that at least is something we can debate. When you move into the gender space, you're just getting, in my opinion, into voodoo and woo. So, I mean, if someone asks, well, what is a woman? A question that the left has proven unable to answer. I think many confident mothers could just say, well, a woman is an adult human female. It's someone from whatever your personal status is, the sex that can have kids. There's a very easy answer. And the people that are saying 2 + 2 is 4, I think over time are always going to beat the people that are arguing that 2 + 2 is 6 using all kind of crazy tricks. This goes back to the ancient Greeks. Sophistry never wins.
Mm-hmm.
For long.
That's definitely true. Now your turn, Jason. Some final thoughts on these woke jargon, made up words, and how they're tied with the SEL programs in our kids' schools.
I would suggest a SEL curriculum audit. A group of parents can always go to the school and ask to see what are we being taught, and to actually sit down with the school leaders and go over what is being taught. Vet it from a parent's perspective, vet it from that ideological perspective. Parents right now are the most powerful and influential people in getting these horrible, dehumanizing ideas out of our school system, because that is where they are at. And the human brain is wired to accept the culture that's placed on it. So if this thing stays on our kids, this is going to be how they are wired to think and the way that they will teach the next generation. And essentially the human species as we knew it will have been conquered.
Definitely, it brings you back to the idea that this is literally like the battle of our lifetimes, because our children's future is what is at stake. As a closing note, I would like to talk to our parents and the audience that is watching us tonight. After this conversation, everything that we have heard from you all regarding all these jargon and made up words, everything that has been uncovered and that many parents are starting to discover in their school districts, it would be basically this notion of always being on top of, being aware of what's going on in your child's schools, to constantly have these open communication channels, asking questions not only to our kids, but also to the teacher, to the principal, to whoever comes up in this kind of like line of responsibility of the way, all the way to the school district and the school board. You can find more resources regarding these topics in our website. We have the guides of understanding the woke jargon, understanding all these new words and jargon that has to do with gender. All these can be found in our website at defendinged.org. If you see something in your school, if you have an incident, a concerning experience in your classroom, please reach out to us. That's what we do as an organization. Send us a message through the website. Try to find us in our social channels. We will try to communicate with you as soon as possible and investigate any concern that you might have in your child's school, and kind of like let other parents know what's going on. I want also to say a huge thank you to the three of you for joining us tonight for this conversation. We really appreciate the time. We know that there is so much more that we need to dissect in this topic. The more we learn from parents' stories and testimonies, the more we receive incidents like this that we have been discussing before, the more we realize that there is such a huge need of information information and education for parents to feel empowered, to have control in directing the way that their children are being raised, the way that their children are being educated. To our audience, if you find that this is going to be helpful, please share this video in your socials, in YouTube, with your friends, with anybody that is willing to engage with you in the conversation that has to do with returning our classrooms back to the instruction of academics, especially in the K-12 grades. Thank you very much to everybody, and you all have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.